Welcome back to another episode of the House Husband Diaries. As always, I am your host, Carter C. And for this episode of the House Husband Diaries, I thought I would do a reprise. I'm going to just do one video instead of a series of videos on, it's more of like an update of the all-time greatest tennis player debate. And I'm interested in tennis, I'm interested in golf, I'm interested in a lot of sports. Not as many sports as I used to be once 2020 became the year of political statements for sports, which I have no use for. Athletes are athletes, they should just play sports, not tell me their politics. So for what that is. So I appreciate most of the tennis players in the world aren't American, and so they don't care about American politics. So that was refreshing in 2020. However, as I sat here 13 months ago and made videos on why Roger Federer was the greatest tennis player of all time, why Rafael Nadal was the greatest tennis player of all time, and why Novak Djokovic should be considered the greatest tennis player of all time. And then I made a fourth video of who I think has the best shot, or who should be considered the greatest tennis player of all time. And I said that 2020 would be a pivotal year in the all-time debate. Little did I know at that time what 2020 was going to bring, and that a few months later we would have a worldwide shutdown, that the French Open would be moved from its typical May into early June to like November, I believe it was, and the Wimbledon would be canceled, and the U.S. Open would be held with no fans, and so the entire tennis calendar changed, and so I just wanted to do an update video and not take too much time, but just kind of give a summary 12 months later as we move into the 2021 calendar year on who is the greatest tennis player, and sort of compare the stats, and I'll try to do some sort of, I think some people made some comments on those prior videos that maybe putting up some numbers and some stats. I have a whiteboard that I'm looking at, that I've written all my stats down. And then there's a great Wikipedia page, Open Era, all-time tennis records and stuff that I look at. It's really fascinating, and I think tennis is the only sport right now where we have three active players that are all in the conversation for being the greatest of all time, which makes it really a fascinating discussion. And I think Rafa has said it best in that when their careers are over, then we can discuss. We'll have a full body of work to discuss, and we'll be able to see. And I think that's 100% true. But it's still fun for us fans who don't go out and play, on the ATP circuit to debate and discuss the merits of where their careers stand right now. So without further ado, I will say that the first thing that we look at, or at least the first thing I look at, is their age, right? So Roger Federer is 39 years old. I'm filming this at the end of December in 2020, and so he's already turned 39. Rafa Nadal is 34 and a half-ish, and Novak Djokovic is 33 and a half-ish. So Roger is at the end of his career. He missed most of 2020 because of knee surgery. He may have had other health issues as well, but he only won 5 matches, I believe it was. I think he was 5-1, and in the Australian Open, and that was it. And then he shut it down for the year. So his year 38 season, he really didn't do a whole lot. And 39, we're waiting to see. I think I saw the news that he's not going to play in the Australian Open because of the knee. So we'll see. But, Roger's career is coming to a close. He might win a few more matches. He might play some 250s, some 500s, and he might try to surpass Jimmy Connors' all-time record of most wins. He's like 30, 35 wins away from that record. I doubt he's going to win the 6 tournaments or so he needs to beat Jimmy Connors' record for most wins, most tournament wins. So, so we're getting sort of to the end of Roger Federer's career, and so that takes into account, a full body of work, or mostly full body of work, and then we're comparing to younger guys to sort of a matured tennis resume. So with that being said, let's look at wins. As I said, total match wins. Roger Federer is second all time, 1,242 as of this filming, which is 238 wins more than Rafa and 308 wins more than Novak Djokovic. So, on total wins, you're looking at, let's just say, 5 years. Rafa's 5 years younger than Roger. About. So 238. Let's just say 250, right? So Rafa would need 50 wins a season for the next 5 years to match total wins. And let's see, I have it written on the board here. Rafa, not counting 2020. So I don't count 2020 for much of my comparison as far as wins, average wins per year, all that kind of stuff, because this year just was a shortened year. It was different. But not counting 2020, in the previous 5 years, Rafa has averaged 54 wins a season. So he would basically need to continue his 29, 30, 31, 32, 33. So basically those 5 years into his 34, 35, 36, 37, and 38 years. Pretty much. Give or take. Djokovic is 70 wins behind Rafa. And he only has averaged 57 or so wins a year. It's basically what Rafa has averaged the last 5 years. So, in that account, Djokovic is behind Rafa's pace. And Rafa is behind Roger's pace, give or take. Roger's won about 48 matches per year the last 5 years. So Rafa and Roger on the wins are pretty close. Djokovic is a little bit behind, and he could make it up. But that's a tall task for Djokovic to average 57 wins a year in his late 30s. So I give the nod to Roger. He's already achieved that many wins, and it's hard to view Rafa and Djokovic with the same lens, because why would those guys play till they're 40 other than to catch Roger in total wins? I don't know that Jimmy Connors is really their mark. I feel like if they can beat Roger in terms of historical presence, then they're the best all time. I don't think Jimmy Connors holds the same cachet to Rafa and Novak as Connors does to Roger Federer. Obviously, Roger was trying to surpass the 14 Grand Slams that Pete Sampras achieved, and he did that a long time ago. So once he did that, he was looking for what would solidify me as the greatest player of all time, the most wins ever, Jimmy Connors, keep playing, and the number one, most weeks number one all time. But we'll get there. So then we look at tournament wins, and Roger has 103 tournament wins, Rafa 86, Novak 81. Like I said, Novak is a year younger than Rafa, so he needs to win at least 5 tournaments next year to be on the same pace as Rafa. This year slowed everyone. I feel like Roger would have won a couple. He'd be a couple closer to Jimmy Connors. He'd be a few more, wins closer. But then again, it was knee surgery that sidelined Roger, so you can't really say. So I don't think that Djokovic and Rafa are going to win the same number of tournaments as Roger when all is said and done. If Djokovic wins 7 tournaments a year, he's 22 tournaments behind. He's got to do that for at least the next 3 years, and that's an incredible year. So he's got to do that in his year 33, 34, and 35 season, win 7 tournaments a year. I don't know if he can do that. Maybe if he wins 3 or 4, he wins 5 or 6 one year. Who knows? We'll see. So here's the big one for you Djokovic fans. Roger has the most weeks at number 1 all time, 310 weeks. And as of January 4th, the rankings are through January 4th, 2021. Novak Djokovic, who finished year in number 1 for a record-tying 6th time with Pete Sampras. Federer and Rafa have 5 year in number 1s for whatever that means. I don't really think that's a stat worth counting. But total weeks number 1 is what matters, not how many year in number 1s. So Djokovic is at 302. He's 8 weeks behind Roger Federer's all-time record of 310 weeks at number 1. And I think that's really interesting because they moved the Australian Open back into February. And so it's almost guaranteed that Djokovic is going to tie and surpass Federer's all-time number 1, weeks at number 1 record in February or March. Almost guaranteed. I don't know the mathematics. I haven't gone through all of that. If Nadal were to win the Australian Open, if Djokovic were to somehow pull out and he would lose all of his points for the Australian Open and Nadal were to win, maybe he would usurp the number 1 seed, the number 1 world ranking from Djokovic, and Djokovic would be at 306 or 308 or something. He'd be just a couple of weeks shy, but the likelihood in a normal year that Djokovic would come back to number 1 for a couple of weeks, it's almost guaranteed that Djokovic will end his career with the most weeks at number 1. And that really is, at this point, that's one of 2 feathers in his cap. I will say that. And then we look at the weeks number 1, which is really the biggest weakness in Nadal's case. He only has spent 209 weeks all time at number 1, which is almost 2 years less than both Roger and Novak, which is incredible on one hand. But on the other hand, knowing that clay court tournaments are much fewer than hard courts, it does make sense, and injuries that Nadal has faced over his career. So then we move down to number of majors. And obviously we know the big story in 2020 was that Rafa won the French Open for a record-breaking 13th time and tied Roger Federer's all-time record of 20 majors, which is incredible. So Djokovic is left at 17, which means he needs to win 3 more majors just to tie Rafa and Roger. And that assumes that Rafa won't win the French Open in a few months, which he is going to be the favorite to win again. And so right now, it looks like the scale for all-time majors tips into Rafa's category. Now, that being said, I did a little look. Since 2017, Roger Federer has won 3 majors. Novak Djokovic has won 5 majors. And Rafa Nadal has won 6 majors. So since 2017, Rafa has actually won more majors than Djokovic. So he's pulling away in the last few years by 1, but still. He's widened the gap, which I find interesting in the last few years. And so the other thing that I find interesting is since 2009 has ended, so go back 8-9 more years, Roger has only won 5 majors since the end of 2009. So Roger Federer has been at 15 to 20 in the last 10 years. He hasn't really moved that a whole lot. So in the last 4 years or so, Rafa has added 6 majors. So he's really come on strong. Now, a lot of people say with the majors that it doesn't really count because Nadal is a clay court master and he's a single surface guy. So if you take the 13 French Open titles away from him, then he's only won 7 majors, which is Stefan Edberg and a few other people, which are really good tennis players, but they're not in the conversation for the greatest all time. And I've never really bought into that. But what I will say is I did some research because I knew that would come up in comments, and it has before. And so I looked, and it's interesting to note that of Nadal's 13 French Open titles, 7 of those have been played against Federer and Djokovic. So Nadal is 4-0 in French Open finals against Roger Federer and 3-0 against Novak Djokovic in French Open finals. So of those 13, he's won more than half against arguably the 2 greatest players of all time, other than himself. So even if you were to take away the 6 French Open titles that he has against non-greatest players of all time, add that to a 7, it's still 14 ties Pete Sampras, right? And then if you were to take those 13 titles away from Nadal, assume that Roger's going to win all of those, that would be 24 majors for Roger. And it would be 20 majors for Djokovic. So you can't really make that assumption and say, oh, well, he's just a clay court specialist, so who cares? That doesn't count, right? I think the career majors is going to tip in favor of Rafa. It just doesn't seem like Djokovic has enough years left to win 23, 24 majors that he's probably going to need to beat whatever Rafa ends up with, 21, 22. We'll see. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to, I guess we'll do this. We'll do one of the interesting things to go back to the weeks at number 1. I thought this is really interesting because everybody focuses on, look at how many weeks, Roger and Djokovic have been at number 1 versus Nadal. But when you look at the number of weeks in the top 2, so whether you're number 1 or number 2, Novak Djokovic has spent 446 weeks in the top 2, which means he's only spent 144 weeks at number 2. Almost all of his time, 3/4 of his time, in the top 2, he's spent at number 1. He's rarely number 2 compared to being number 1. Roger Federer has spent 528 weeks in the top 2, 310 of which number 1. So he's only spent, 40% of his time at number 2. Most of the time, 60% of the time, he's at number 1 if he's in the top 2. On the other hand, Nadal has spent 568 weeks in the top 2. He spent 40 more weeks up to this point in the top 2 than Roger Federer, and 122 more weeks in the top 2 than Novak Djokovic. So when you're talking about excellence, being number 1 or number 2, not just number 1, but then being right there at number 2, Nadal has spent almost a year more than Roger Federer in the top 2. But he spent 2 years less time at number 1. So really interesting. So with that being said, it's the same way with what I said with Djokovic. He's almost guaranteed to spend another dozen weeks or so in the top 2. I mean, we'll see what Dominic Thiem does and Djokovic does in the Australian Open. But it looks like, Rafa's going to run away with the most weeks all time in the top 2. Now, whether he gets back to number 1 and closes that gap a little bit, I mean, he's got a long way to go before he gets into the conversation of some of the greats at number 1. And I don't think he'll ever, get anywhere close in the weeks at number 1. But is that the most important stat? for greatest of all time. Most weeks at number one? No, not even close. Most major titles? Probably. Best winning percentage? I guess that's the other thing I skipped, right? Right now, Rafa has 83.1% winning percentage. Djokovic, 82.9%. Almost neck and neck. Roger Federer, 82.1%. They're all within 1% of each other. But Roger's won 200 to 300 more matches than the other two. What's more impressive? I think that's a push. I mean, check mark for Rafa, right? Because he's the all-time leader in win percentage. But it really is a toss-up. All right, so then I'm going to go to head-to-head. We're almost done here. The biggest blemish on Roger Federer's career in terms of the greatest of all time debate is the fact that he has a losing record against both Nadal and Djokovic. The two other guys that we consider to be the greatest tennis players of all time, Roger Federer has a losing record against. He's 16-24 against Nadal. That's not even close, right? And he's 23-27 against Djokovic. So he needs 8 wins. He needs to go 8-0 against Nadal, and he needs to go 4-0 against Djokovic. Not going to happen. So he's going to end his career with losing records, badly losing record to Nadal, and a somewhat better losing record to Djokovic, but still losing record to both. This, obviously, is a big feather in the cap of Djokovic because he has that 27-23 win advantage over Federer, but he also has a 29-27 win advantage over Nadal. Now, for people that like to point that out, oh, well, look, he's beaten Nadal more than Nadal's beaten him. They've tied on grass, and they have the same record against each other on clay and or it's switched up on clay and hard courts. They've just played 2 more matches on hard courts, and so Nadal has won 2 more matches over. I believe it's 2 more matches over Djokovic on clay, and Djokovic has won 2 more matches over Nadal on hard courts, but they've played 2 more matches on hard courts, so those 2 wins go to Djokovic. So it's pretty much a dead heat. If they played 2 more matches on clay, Nadal would probably win those, and that's a moot point. But at this point, Djokovic does have head-to-head on both of those guys. Federer, 4 wins. Federer is on his way out. I don't think that's gonna come back. Nadal probably gonna end with a losing record against Djokovic, but does it really matter? And then you take it one step further and you say, okay, well, Nadal may have a losing record just slightly to Djokovic, but in major finals, he has a winning record. He's won 5 of the 9 major finals against Djokovic. So what really counts? Those 2 random hard court matches or an additional major final and major trophy? I think most people would take the major final. Winning record in major finals is more important than random tennis matches throughout the career. All right, I'm going to end this video. It's getting a little long, and thanks so much for watching. But the one thing that I'll end it on is, so what do we need for each, or what does each player need the other 2 players to do in order to hold on or retain or win without a doubt the argument of who is the greatest tennis player of all time? So for Roger, he needs Nadal to just stop playing. Nadal needs to just stop. He's already tied Federer with 20 major titles. He's got a better winning percentage, and he has less tournament wins, less overall wins, and he's already got 40 more weeks in the top 2, but he's 100 weeks less at number 1. So Roger Federer needs Nadal to just stop playing. because anything that Nadal does in terms of wins moving forward is just going to bolster Nadal's case versus Roger Federer. That's it. There's just no other way to look at that. Every win that Nadal gets, he gets closer to wiping away any argument that Roger Federer fans or Roger Federer has against Nadal, is saying that Nadal is not the best all time versus Roger. What does Rafa need to do, really, to get a stranglehold on that title of greatest tennis player of all time? And I would say that, I guess I need to go back to Roger needs Djokovic to play less than 3 Djokovic years, like dominant years. But if he has 2 more dominant years and then fades, it'll be close. But if Djokovic has 3 more dominant years, he'll overtake Roger as well, excluding what Rafa does. So we'll move to Rafa. What does Rafa need? He needs 1 more Rafa year. He needs about 50 to 60 wins. He needs another major or 2 in that year. And then he needs about 2 good years, just solid years, 40 to 50 wins, and maybe a major, So we'll have 2 or 3 more majors, and he'll average, he'll get about 150 more wins, and he'll be pretty much solid as the best player of all time, unless Djokovic has 3 more dominant years. Djokovic really needs 3 dominant years and then 1 to 2 more good years. But Djokovic hasn't won 70 matches in a year since 2015. So is he really in his year 33 season, is he really going to bring it back to when he was 27 and had a dominant year? I don't think so. But I think that's some of the intrigue that we lost in 2020 with the tennis season being the way it was. Federer's knee, which is going to happen. He may not be able to play anymore. Rafa didn't want to play in the U.S. Open because of COVID. And then, everybody was just kind of mixing and matching tournaments, and it just wasn't the same field. So it'll be really interesting to see in 2021 how the tournaments play out, how the season plays out. And then one last closing thing for you Djokovic fans, because I know in my previous videos there were a lot of Djokovic fans that watched my videos and commented and talked about how I didn't really respect or like Djokovic. And I respect him. I think he's a good player. I just don't think I think he's number 3 in the all-time pecking order, and rightfully so. I think he's had a high peak, but I don't think his peak was as good as Roger's, and he just hasn't had the length of career. He didn't start as early as Nadal being as successful, and he doesn't have the length of Roger. But I will say 2020 hurt Djokovic more than any of the other 2 in this conversation, because he was the odds-on favorite to win Wimbledon. And if he had won Wimbledon, he'd be 18. He'd have more wins. He'd have a higher winning percentage. He'd have, I don't know if he'd have more weeks or not at number 1. I didn't look to see when he overcame it. He probably would have had, I think they stopped tracking weeks at number 1 because they weren't playing any tournaments. So he would have lost some of the weeks, because I think Rafa would have, with the clay court season being normally in the spring, he probably would have retained number 1, would have beaten Djokovic, gotten a few more weeks. So maybe Djokovic has, maybe he's split. He lost out on a major he probably would have won, and then he would have, wouldn't have as many weeks at number 1. Who knows? But then again, Djokovic totally botched the U.S. Open by accidentally hitting that lines judge in the throat. And, maybe he'd have 19 majors. Maybe he would have won the U.S. Open, and maybe he would have won Wimbledon. I mean, how crazy would that have been? And then we'd be sitting here with Djokovic at 19 and Rafa and Roger at 20 majors apiece. And that would be insane. All right. I know it's getting long, up to 30 minutes, but let me know what you think in the comments. Like, subscribe, do whatever you got to do. Thanks so much for watching this episode of the House Husband Diaries. And, this will probably be my last sports episode for, probably for the year until the end of the tennis. And unless something major happens, I don't really see myself doing any of these sports videos anymore. I'm really moving more into, the philosophy and politics and stuff. Interesting conversations. I'll have guests. You'll see. As more episodes come out. But I just wanted to finish this episode and kind of wrap up from a year ago. So thanks so much for watching this episode of the House Husband Diaries. Until next time, talk to you then.